This portion of the Gospel of John is typically titled Jesus' Arrest and Peter's Denials. While I can understand why those titles were chosen, they seem appropriate. I'm going to challenge them. I'm going to challenge them because they highlight the wrong parts of the story. This story is about God being God and Peter being all that it is to be human. This passage is about the difference between being human and being Jesus.
Amen.
This is arguably one of the most famous parts of Peter's story. Unfortunately for Peter, it highlights his overwhelming desire to be right, his lack of faith, and his crippling fear. Fortunately for Peter, there is so much more to his story. Fortunately for you, I don't have time to rehash word by word Peter's entire journey with Jesus. But I do encourage you to read it on your own.
Amen.
What I will do now is give you the highlight reels of Peter's journey with Jesus. Then I will walk us through what Suzanne just read and explain what happened the night that Jesus died. that Jesus was arrested. I'll wrap up by helping you see that God's love is present amongst our hardest circumstances and during our deepest regrets. I want to start by being real, guys. We all know a guy like Peter. If we're being honest, some of us don't really care for guys like Peter. You guys all know Peter, the guy who you're sitting in class with who has to raise his hand after everything that's said by the teacher or instructor. The one who has to always ask the question, the one that always goes on and on for far too long. You just roll your eyes when this person opens their mouth. Yeah, that's the guy that I'm talking about. And if we're being honest, some of us are Peter. We love to be loved. We like to stand out amongst our peers, to be the best and the brightest. We love to hear affirmations from our leaders, and we like to stand up for our causes, shaking our fists. Well, it doesn't matter if you've met a guy like Peter or if you are Peter. We all have experienced Peter. Well, here's a little bit about this Peter. Peter is a special disciple of Jesus in the Gospel of John. His name is used 3 times more than any other disciple in the Gospel. And the moment that Jesus lies his eyes on Peter, he gives him a new identity. Jesus looks at him and says, "So, you're Simon, the son of John? Now you're going to be Peter." Jesus acted as soon as he met Peter. Jesus began to change him. Maybe Jesus knew that a Peter was missing from the crowd. So he went ahead and he made a Peter. Maybe every group needs a Peter.
Yes.
Either way, the relationship between Jesus and Peter is transformative and distinct from the very start. Peter often stood out from amongst his fellow disciples. Peter was visible and Peter was vocal. Peter stayed to learn more when others wanted to walk away. Peter was the first disciple to recognize Jesus as the Son of God. Peter was the only disciple to object when Jesus was humbling himself and washing the disciples' feet. None of them really understood why Jesus was doing it, and I'm sure that all of them were uncomfortable with Jesus doing it. But good old Peter, he can't just leave well enough alone. He's not going to let the Son of God wash his dirty feet. "You're not going to wash my feet," Peter says. Bless you. And you can bless you again. You can almost feel the other disciples sigh and roll their eyes. But it doesn't stop there. Peter gets more Peter. When he learns that Jesus needs to wash his feet, he tells Jesus he wants more. "Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head." It's so obvious that Peter wants as much Jesus as he can get, and he's not afraid to ask for more. Asking for more begins to turn on Peter, though, at the beginning of the Last Supper. As Jesus begins to prepare his disciples for his last lessons, Peter's desire for more begins to cause him pain. At the Last Supper, Jesus reveals that one of the disciples is going to betray him. Jesus doesn't say who, and naturally the disciples all sit and look at each other in silence, and they wonder, which one is it going to be? But not Peter. Good old Peter. He pipes up and he asks. After supper, Jesus has more somber news and lovingly addresses his disciples as little children. He tells them that where he is going, they cannot follow. The way Jesus says this is cryptic, but for sure the disciples know that the end is coming. Like little children, they remain silent, processing the words that they don't understand and that they don't want to hear. Peter cannot comprehend not following Jesus, and he will not stay silent. In his childlike love for Jesus, he says, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I want to lay down my life for you." This is when Peter's love for Jesus begins to outweigh his ability to follow Jesus. Peter can't see that his love is turning to sin, his devotion to self-will. Peter in his childlike faith wants to follow Jesus. Peter in his childlike faith doesn't understand that at this point, he's unable. Peter is pledging to go to any length. Peter is also overestimating his dedication to Jesus.
Good point. Good point.
But Jesus knows Peter better than Peter. Jesus knows everything there is to know about Peter, including Peter's limits. Jesus knows Peter will not lay down his life for him tonight. In a hard moment of truth and grace, Jesus tells Peter, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the cock will not crow until you've denied me 3 times." Here is where we turn our attention back to tonight's part of the story. The night titled as Jesus' arrest and Peter's denials. Jesus' disciples have followed him into a very familiar place. But this time that familiar place is dark, and that they know that the end is near. This time, in the garden, they will not meet just their master. Judas is on his way with a mob, and that mob is armed with torches and weapons to take Jesus away in chains. Amongst the disciples, there is no conversation. What would anyone, even Peter, have to say in a situation like this? The mob arrives, and Jesus begins the questioning. That's right, Jesus began the questioning. He asks twice who they seek, and they tell him Jesus of Nazareth, and twice he replies, "I am he." Jesus started the conversation, and Jesus ends it. Just as Jesus fully surrenders and seeks to release his disciples of any risk of arrest, Peter's sword flashes, and he strikes the high priest's slave and cuts off his ear. The surrender barely leaves Jesus' lips, and Peter springs into action. While the other disciples stood silent, this time Peter would not use words to express his devotion. For Peter, this situation escalated way past the point of words. The same man who would not let the Lord wash his feet without protest will certainly not stand by while somebody takes his Lord captive. The mob did not take Jesus by force or by violent act. In fact, the only weapon drawn is Peter's. Peter did what Peter thought was an act of loyalty. He defended his Lord in what some scholars say is Peter's way of laying down his life for his Lord. But again, Peter has overestimated his ability. Peter isn't meant to trade his life for Jesus's. And in another moment of truth and grace, Jesus corrects Peter. Jesus is quick to de-escalate the confrontation, tells Peter to put his sword away. Jesus is going to do what the Father has asked him to do. Now, as a man of action, Peter follows Jesus. His sword might be done, but he isn't. Peter and the disciple continue on. They follow Jesus right into the enemy's house. Well, one of them does. The disciple who remains unnamed has to sneak Peter in past the doormaid. Let's let that soak in for a minute. Peter was just in the garden, swinging a sword around, and cut off a servant's ear. He is now standing outside of the door of the master of that servant, of the high priest of that servant. Peter standing outside the door, sneaking, trying to get in. And he's not invited in, he's not welcome in. He's waiting to be snuck in. That's like running over a Secret Service agent and knocking on the White House doors. Peter is not letting fear stop him from following Jesus. Peter is showing incredible dedication to Jesus. The other disciple speaks to the maid and gets Peter in. On the way in, the maid is doing her job, and she says, "Aren't you also one of this man's disciples?" Again, it's an expected question. She's the doorkeeper. It's her job to know who comes and goes and what their business is in the house. So being asked if he was another disciple wasn't a surprise to anyone. And just as Jesus said he would, Peter says, "I am not." Peter boldly walks right next to some of the servants who are warming themselves by a charcoal fire. He is now in light of the charcoal fire, shoulder to shoulder with the enemy. And while his disciples remain blended into the crowd, Jesus is questioned about his teaching and his disciples. Scholars believe that Jesus purposely crafted his answers to deflect attention from his disciples, who were now in the crowd, and bring focus back to just himself. Jesus is protecting his disciples. Jesus knows that the time has come for him to protect those whom he loves. They remain safe, while he quite literally takes a hit. After he begins to answer their questions, again, an act of unexpected violence interrupts Jesus. Frustrations have built, and he is struck by an officer. Now here you might expect Peter to jump out of the crowd, swinging his sword again, defending his master. He does not. Where is our response from Peter? What happened to that guy? Instead, we read on that Jesus responds to the violence with some questions for his captors, questions they cannot or will not answer. We are then told that Jesus is taken away. This time, his disciples remain silent. The story then turns back to Peter. It's almost as if the author is looking at Peter saying, "Well, Peter?" We pick right back up at the scene by the charcoal fire. Peter is there amongst the enemy when he is asked a second time, "Aren't you also one of this man's disciples?" Same question, different circumstances. He is no longer at the door with a chance of running to freedom should he be identified. He is shoulder to shoulder with the servants. He answers in the exact same 3 words that he answered before, "I am not." The tension is building, yet Peter remains emotionless. This is not the same Peter from the garden at all. Tension increases, and yet again, as the next question comes with more detail from a particular person, a relative of the guy whose ear Peter just cut off, asks, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" Reading this, I want to slink down in my chair. I want to pull the covers over my eyes. Peter is standing amongst the enemy by a warm charcoal fire on a dark, cold night, and he denied it again. We are told instantly the cock crowed.
Amen.
Notice Peter's words, "I am not," twice. Recall Jesus' words in the garden, "I am he," twice. Notice the stark difference there. Jesus volunteered his identity. Peter hid his. Peter, the one disciple given a special identity, could only muster, "I am not." Jesus ultimately carried out Peter's words. Jesus laid down his life. Peter, the one guy, the number one guy, the guy who so desperately wanted to be with Jesus always, the guy who was willing to go to any length, ran out of faith. That guy was human. Peter finally reached his human limitations and fell short of his own ideal. Despite his new identity in Jesus, despite his exclamations of knowing who Jesus was, and despite his best efforts to lay down his life and follow Jesus, "I am not," came out of his mouth. Jesus said, "I am he." Peter said, "I am not." Such a short and clear division between Jesus' ability and human inability. But that's not the end of the story. Not only was Jesus resurrected, but so was Peter's zeal, eagerness, and willingness to follow his Lord. The Gospel of John closes with Peter and Jesus having a conversation about Peter's love for the Lord. 3 times Peter asks if he loves him, and 3 times Peter exclaims, "Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus did not ask 3 times because Jesus needed to make sure that Peter loved him. Jesus already knew that Peter loved him. He wanted Peter to know that Peter's human limitations did not conflict with his love for Jesus. Peter's limitations were shown only because of his love for Jesus. For the majority of the Gospel of John, Peter is Jesus' number one guy. At every opportunity, he strives to please and protect Jesus. He is that guy. For a brief time, he painfully realizes that he just simply can't be that guy all the time. There were circumstances and situations that caused Peter to realize his limitations and to deny his relationship with Jesus. And for a while after that, I'm sure during his biggest regrets, there was confusion, disappointment, and uncertainty. But that didn't last forever. Jesus returns to remind him that he can be that guy again. So I return to my opening challenge. Jesus did not simply get arrested, Jesus surrendered. Jesus, who knew all that was to befall him, he was seized and bound. He took the hit, and he went on the cross so that love could conquer. Peter's denials were so much more than a man refusing to be associated with an arrested man. Peter's denials highlight the difference between being a follower of Jesus and being Jesus. Peter did not know his limitations, but Jesus did. Jesus knew everything about Peter, and he picked Peter. He picked that guy. As I come to a close, I'd like to leave us with encouragement and good news. Being human may limit our ability, but it most certainly does not limit Jesus's. Thank you.